Hello and welcome back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. This is a book that was written in 1970. It's currently out of print, and since Miss Caldwell has passed away, I'm not sure who's in charge of giving rights on this, so I'm waiting to try to find out, how to get permission. In the meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and continue to read since it is out of print. It's a hard to find copy, so with some luck, you can find one either through Amazon, through a reseller, or sometimes you get lucky in a used bookstore. So we are currently at chapter 4, and that in the book is actually on page 64. So we shall begin with chapter 4, part 1. Tarsus, whom her inhabitants called the jewel of the Cydnus River, was essentially a Phoenician city, commercial, murmurous with business and traffic, both by water and highways, possessed of excellent academies and schools, mercantile establishments, factories, perfumers, weavers, forgers, endless shops, remarkable museums and music halls, the freedom of Roman citizenship, cursed with a bureaucracy, gleaming with temples to many gods, Hellenistic in attitude though Oriental in emotion, famed for her craftsmen, enriched by her pirates who lived respectable and respected lives in their fine villas, wine shops, baths, bakeries, carpet manufacturers, banks, stock markets, inns where Egyptian cooks served superb meals, brothels, licentious theaters, arenas for sports and gladiatorial combats. Many were the natives who proudly called themselves a little Rome. For a score of races lived here, and the narrow streets clamored with a multitude of tongues. Here lived Syrians and Sidonians, students from Asia Minor, Nubians and Scythians, Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, Assyrians, pale-eyed barbarians from the forest of Europe, slaves, Gauls, Britons, artists, jewelers, and the owners of bookshops, scribes knowing a dozen tongues, physicians, and tens of thousands of free mobs who idled, worked when hunger threatened, scrawled graffiti on the walls at night, vociferously adored some local politician, or as vociferously derided him, haunted the arenas, hunted slaves, fought with the police on occasion, gave their measure of robbers to the streets, served any master, gambled, diced, pimped, labored, sweated, cheated, and behaved as the market rabble has always behaved and will invariably behave. They adored actors and acrobats and gladiators, extolled them one day and put their lives in danger the next. They harassed unprotected young girls, hurrying with messages for rich mistresses, and were emotional, passionate, dangerous, colorful, frightening, seething, amusing, and lively, stinking and wildly generous, and in general heartily enjoyed their lives and hourly blasphemed the gods, and paid taxes only when pursued by a resolute publican accompanied by slaves with staves, or legionnaires carrying fasces. They were the terror and the vitality of the night, and vehemence of the day, and like all who lived by their wits and infrequent labor, they were exceedingly clever and full of wit. Cities without a market rabble could not survive, Aristo told his pupil Saul. They would expire of boredom, for respectability has a certain deadness, an ennui about it, a certain lack of life. It is the market rabble, dexterously turning a drachma or a sesterce, or a copper here and there, which enlivens and creates trade, inspires the greed which is the mother of ambition and fortune, raises temples, gives the gods changeful faces, stimulates fashions, removes the lead from the boots of soldier and police, forms a subject against which priests and teachers and lawmakers can inveigh. What else could they do? And if their luster is garish and gaudy and cheap, at least it is luster and could not be despised, and should not be despised. Their charlatanry, their brazen robberies, their wit and their cavortings, their heedlessness and their lewdness, their cruelty and their frequent violent compassion, are closer to the real nature of man, my Saul, than are the sober-faced philosophers and the writers of books. It is the market rabble, in truth, which inspire theses and book writing and the best of plays. For that which is raucous and furious and even vicious has more verity before the sun than all the old Greek virtues of continence, reflection, modesty, and stoic imperative. This is something, added Aristo, which you will find angrily denied by those who believe even the common man can be greater than he is, or that any man can become like the gods. But then these sad defenders of the public weal and these fantasy weavers are far removed from knowledge and validity and reality, and one could pity them if they were not so dangerous. Saul thought that Aristo was merely conducting an exercise in perversity and contradiction, but since he had known Dassel, he was no longer certain. The girl, though a slave and protected, was of the market rabble also. He could not despise her. In truth, because of her, he saw mankind as it was, and not as he had hoped it would be, and love filled him rather than repulsion. But he could not believe with the smiling Aristo that evil was as necessary as good, and that good without evil would be a veritable hell of listlessness and dankness. He explained over and over the glories and the sweetnesses of the lost Eden, and Aristo always replied, "One should be grateful to your Adam and Eve. Not only did they set men free from absolute virtue, but they made them wholly human. They bore in their loins the beauty and the madness of cities, great sales of commerce, and the delight of theaters and dancing girls, and all the infinite variety of life as we know it, and without which we would live in a world of a single color, like babes in their nurseries. They were also very wise. They forbore to eat the tree of life before feasting on the tree of wisdom. For what man would be immortal?" On this they had always disputed, and Aristo, Saul would think, flourished in disputations, all cynical and full of skepticism, all sharp and laughing. But since the youth had known Dassel, he found himself listening more closely to Aristo, who could give a keen edge to any discourse and fire the mind even if it disagreed with him. You will notice in Tarsus, as you will notice in Rome and Alexandria, and Athens in the future, that we Greeks are given even vice a refinement which grosser races could never attain, said Aristo. All men are vile, as your Solomon has said, and is he not considered your wisest king? But vileness should not be, among men, a muddy animal vileness, though I wrongfully denigrate the animals in this instance, but the vileness of the elegant and the gracious gods. That which you Jews call sin has inspired more poetry than virtue, and certainly more temples. What would man be without danger and war and terror and harpies and furies and even death? A sad little languid creature munching fruit under a changeless tree in a paradise on which terrible winds never descended, nor any wave rushed, nor any thunder sounded. Without controversy there can be no wise argument. Without dissension there can be no agreement. Without disaster there can be no peace. And all the meaning of the words. In a deeper subtlety than you know, Saul, wickedness created virtue, and all the arts and vitality. Contrast Saul is the only thing which makes life interesting, and wine and love, of course. Saul contemplated. He could never agree on a single point with Aristo, but Aristo, like Dassel, awakened him to the many-faceted crystal of existence and its endless colors. Hillel had attempted this, but as Saul did not respect his mind, he had not succeeded. He was not attracted to the vice of Tarsus, which he often saw, but he was less horrified and more saddened now at the sight of the tinted male whores he saw in the streets, and the cheap, dissolute women in rough garments or in rich litters. He no longer averted his eyes from the incense-fuming heathen temples of a score of alien religions. It was true that all mankind seemed desperately, if joyously, determined to debauch the human spirit, especially in the hot streets of Tarsus. But Saul was less nauseated or made angry by this display of depravity. He pitied it, and pitied all its votaries. Not to these had been given the Torah, the prophets, Moses, and Solomon, and the promise of the Messiah. Or if the vision had been given, witness the Greek worship of the unknown God, it had been nebulous and uncertain. Once Saul even entered a Greek temple and had looked at its marvelous and simple beauty and its heroic and graceful statues, and all the cloudy incense and the flowers and the charming vistas. There, too, he had found the empty altar, simple and plain and untenanted, and inscribed to the unknown God. It waited for that which would give it significance and truth. For those who did not know what had been precisely promised the Jews, Saul felt bitter tears in his eyes. Hillel had often told him, "A Gentile is not less in the sight of God than a pious and reverent devoted Jew. He, too, is a child of God the Father, blessed be his glorious name. He, too, according to the prophets, will partake of the salvation of the Messiah. No man must be despised, nor considered lesser than another. You must honor his manhood, his brotherhood before God. You must deal with him justly and in honor. You must give him your compassion and your hand, even if he reject it. Diverse though we are, for the Father loves diversity as he created it, in a most strange and mystical way, mankind is all one. It has been said by Egyptian scientists that light, which appears to us to have 1,000 hues and tints, and is composed of endless colors, is truly but one light, and that light is the Spirit of God and of man." Saul had listened dutifully with the deep love he bore his father, but he had considered Hillel too simplistic and too devoid of the pride of a Jew whose fathers had been given a covenant with God, and of whose flesh the Messiah would be born. But now, as he daily walked the streets of Tarsus in the burnished autumn sunlight, he felt less pride than compassion, and he wondered why it was that other men had not been enlightened also. The Greeks had their moral code, and so had the Romans and the Egyptians, but it had been a code rooted in some ethical principle, and not in the Ancient of Days. Ethical principles devoid of a source could be destroyed or abandoned by change, but principles established on eternal stone could never be moved. Love, though he did not know it, had given him not only a sense of completely belonging to all humanity, but a tender and powerful pity for it. And sorrowfully, in the end, because he was still very young and inexperienced, and had no confidant, love brought him a terror and a wrath and a disillusionment from which he was never completely to recover, and which was to haunt all his life, cause him agony, and confound and baffle those necessary to him. In all his short life, Saul had never seen a morning so absolutely golden, so resonant with aureate tints and shades, so tawny and ebullient and life-compelling. Though it was autumn and the dying year, the darkness of the cypresses emphasized the fiery yellow of the other trees. Tamarisks were still green, but their boughs were gilded with the first topaz sun. Amber water poured smoothly with gentle thunder over the russet rocks, and the pool itself was almost still and shiningly saffron. Crimson and lemon-yellow flowers bordered it, and the tall grass was umbrous. The little rills and brooks which flowed from the pool quivered in bright copper over the land. The sky above was a deep purple still, pierced by shafts of bronze-like spears in the east, and beyond the very mountains appeared like lion-colored and writhing heaps of stone, pathed with the first thin snows. Saul carried a basket of scarlet pomegranates in his hand for Dassel, and the scent of them, mingled with the scent, rich and fruity, from the land, excited him strangely, and he felt his heart rise with promise and unknown excitement, and it made him hurry along the empty and twisting road to the cataract and the pool. Once there, he surveyed it with delight. His heart was still pacing rapidly, and he smiled exuberantly, and a rejoicing in life filled him. The psalms of adoration seemed too puny to him to express the rapture he felt, and the nameless anticipation. He looked about for Dassel, but she was not there. Then suddenly he trembled with fright. A jackal had appeared on the opposite side of the pond, and the yellow creature had escaped his first notice, for he blended so completely with the other natural tints about him. It was known that jackals carried rabies with them, and inflicted the incurable wound mentioned by Hippocrates, and Saul had watched a favorite young servant die some years ago, choking with agony after the bite of a jackal. Jackals were sly but cowardly creatures. Unless mad, they did not attack human beings. But once mad, they were like tigers. Saul's first impulse was to run, to find Dassel, and to keep her from approaching the pond if she were on the way. Then he was again affrighted. The jackal had seen him. Instead of slinking away, as was the nature of jackals, the animal's legs stiffened, his fur bristled, and his evil head appeared to engorge. His wild eyes glowed in the first light, and from his throat there issued a terrible snarling, so the creature was afflicted with the dread disease. Saul now saw the line of bloody foam along the jackal's jaw. Stricken with terror, Saul could not look away. He dared not flee for fear of pursuit. Holding the animal with his eyes, he slowly bent and lifted a heavy and jagged stone in his hand. Then he shouted menacingly. The jackal retreated a pace or two, but his snarling was like the grinding of rocks, and then he uttered a howl of madness and shook from head to foot. But he retreated no more. It was then that Dassel appeared, laughing, calling to Saul, because she had heard his shout, and she had believed that he was summoning her in impatience. There she stood, only a few paces from the jackal, and on the mossy bank of the pool, looking across the water at Saul, and smiling gaily and waving. Sweat rushed out upon Saul's flesh, and he was dumb. Then, as Dassel continued her waving, and was beginning to seem a trifle perplexed, Saul found his voice. "Go into the water, Dassel," he called. "Swim to me. Do not hesitate. There is a jackal near you, and he is mad." The girl turned her head and saw the beast. He had begun to crouch for the charge upon her. She faintly screamed and fell back. "Swim!" shouted Saul, almost beside himself. "To me, now!" Dassel flung herself into the water, not removing the cloak she wore against the cool morning wind. Her clothing restrained her strokes, She twisted and turned in the water too slowly, and Saul dropped the basket of pomegranates and stepped into the water himself. He had a confused thought that as rabies brought about fear and dread of water, the jackal would turn away. But Saul was hardly a few feet from the bank when the animal hurled himself into the pool in pursuit of Dassel. Now he was howling and choking in a frenzy, and the horrid sounds echoed in the morning silence. Saul clenched the jagged stone in his fist and began to swim toward Dassel. He swam between her and the enraged beast, and the yellow head was like a mat of wool above the water. Saul kicked off his sandals and tore off his cloak and summoned all his strength to intercept the jackal and save Dassel from a fatal bite. The water was chill and paralyzing, for the year was late. Saul saw Dassel's desperate white face above the water, and the long black floating of her hair, and the entangling cloak in her threshing arms. She was whimpering and straining in her flight. Her eyes implored him for rescue. Now he was between the jackal and the girl. "Swim faster," he shouted, resolutely facing the tormented animal. "Reach the bank." He had heard that the power of the human eye was feared by beasts, and he fixed his eyes on the jackal and did not look again at Dassel, whose gasping he heard behind him. The jackal, however, had apparently not known that he was to fear the human eye, or he was too maddened. He halted briefly in the water, churning and snarling. Now his attention was fixed solely on Saul. The pool foamed about his struggling legs. Saul clearly saw that the rabid glare in the jackal's eyes, and for a moment or two he felt renewed and shaking terror, for his own life was at stake. His legs appeared to have a life of their own, urging him to flee and save himself, but he could not abandon Dassel. The thought did not even occur to him. His heart was one lump of straining fire in his chest. The jackal hesitated. Saul was swimming between him and his first pursuit, and so was nearer. He half lifted himself in the water, howling, and launched himself at the youth. And at that instant Saul's strong legs came down and encountered a rock in the water, on which he stood, and his whole sturdy body tightened itself for the attack, and fear left him. His mind moved with amazing speed and order. He waited until the jackal was almost upon him, jaws open and slavering, teeth blood-stained and snapping. Then he reached out swiftly and caught the animal by the throat with his left hand and struck him fiercely on the very top of the head with the jagged stone he still held. The sharp point sank between the wild eyes deeply, and a hideous streak of pain burst from the afflicted creature. He fought to release himself as blood welled about the dagger-like point of stone. Saul shuddered with loathing at the sight and the feel of him. But he clung to the matted throat, tore out the stone, and this time he plunged it directly into the right eye of the beast, turning and thrusting it with incredible strength. He felt it reach the soft and fevered brain, and now he clenched his teeth with renewed resolution, withdrew the stone again, and drove it into the animal's throat, just above his own hand, and again he turned and thrust with all the power he could produce. The water about him was stained with deadly scarlet in an instant, and the rising sun glittered on the cataract and on the pool, and Saul was bloodied. Saul felt the dying animal relax and become limp, but again he thrust the stone into the left eye, using his last strength. The jackal sank below the surface of the water, slowly in scarlet ripples, and died, its legs and body flaccid and drifting. Cut it out, Robbie. Saul, watching that sinking and shuddering again, he had never killed anything before. He could bear his own breath in the stillness. Raucous and groaning, he retreated from the spot where the animal had died, and he began to wash his arms and hands with clear water, for the fear of the gouts of blood on them. and the lethal saliva and any fleck of foam which might have been ejected onto his flesh. Then he thought of Dassel. He turned and began to swim to the bank. The slave girl had collapsed upon the warming earth in a huddle of wet clothing, her face stark and still as she watched Saul's approach. She could not move, even when he was beside her. She could only stare at him, as gray as death, her black eyes great in her face.